Today, we want to move our perspective up in the prismatic organization framework. And what we're going to try and do is look at an organization at its own level of complexity. The organization is a formally constituted entity. And this is the first time that's happening. Even though we've talked about task groups, etc., we've emphasized the dynamic and informal nature of those things. And if we're talking about a formally constituted task group, we're actually implying that it was constituted by some greater authority. So we even in doing that, we were looking forward to this particular perspective. So now we'll have an opportunity to examine it a little bit more closely. And what we'll also do is we'll look at the concepts from your text today in the context of this level of systemic complexity. Now we're going to continue to do this through next week as well. So we'll continue to examine key organizational variables, those emergent characteristics that arise at this particular level of systemic inclusiveness, both in their own right and also as they relate to the content for next week. By the way, as we're talking about next week, I'd also remind you that your flow charts are due next week. You have the Schaefer article available to you. It's in PDF form on the D2L site. It's not difficult. It's frankly, it's kind of boring. And it's going to look real technical. Nah, it's just a case of using different symbols to denote different kinds of decision points or activities or products along the way. This is really something of an elaboration of your timeline. So I refer you back to the instructions in the syllabus in terms of the basic nature of the exercise. So just go ahead and do it. And again, this is intended as an exercise to give you the opportunity to experience this, get some kind of familiarity with it. If you run into difficulty, you have the opportunity to do it again. This isn't going to be something that's you should spend a great deal of anxiety about. Yes?
Do you want us to use the data from the timeline for the first?
Again, I'd ask you to go back and look at the specific requirements in the syllabus for the exam. Follow those. But if, in fact, it's one of those kind of things where you can use what you did in the timeline and still they fall within the parameter of the assignment as described, feel free to go ahead and do that. There's no penalty. There's no reason not to. Okay. Excuse me? You can do it. Yeah. There are places where you can go on the websites where you can actually generate it, and print the thing out. If you want to do it on typing paper or ruled paper, just make it neat. That's all I ask you to do. Just go ahead and make it neat. Okay. This slide represents the basic kind of things that we're going to be talking about for the next several weeks, as a matter of fact, when we're talking about the organization and its emergent characteristics. And one of the ways of thinking about that is to talk about the structure of organizations and basic structural variables that are common in the organizational administrative literature. Among those are these. And so we'll deal with each one of these somewhat in turn and also to some extent as they relate to one another. We're also going to be talking about a little bit more about formal and informal structure, but that won't be a one-time only kind of discussion because as we go through this, we're going to see a number of ways that the informal structure emerges, a number of ways the informal structure manifests itself. And so we'll keep coming back, as a matter of fact, not only to what was formally intended, formally constituted within an organization, but the almost infinite variety of ways in which people express themselves, their individuation, but also the way they work and the way they relate to one another, because those are the things that really generate the informal organization. By the way, one of the other things in general that generates the informal organization is the fact that very, very many organizations, if they were to function exactly and only as their designers intended wouldn't work. Right? They'd be way, way late, they'd be way, way shoddy in terms of their products, or things would just grind to a halt. So in many respects, one of the most important reasons that informal organizations develop anyway is to get work done. And is to fill in that infinite number of little gaps and ambiguities or mistakes that may have been embedded in terms of organizational structure in its variety of ways, including its technologies, its procedures, its policies, etc. Now, as we're talking about organizational structure, let me go ahead and offer a definition for you right away. Whenever we're talking about structure in the human services, in the social sciences, we're really talking about patterns. Patterns. So we're talking about patterns of behavior. In an organizational context, we've got that mantle of a formal organization wrapped around it, so that people come into work at certain times, they're addressed in certain ways, they go to certain offices, they have access to certain kind of information, people expect them to have certain levels of authority. Right? All of those things happening day in, day out over time represents the patterns that we're going to break down in terms of different dimensions of organizational structure. The informal organization then represents all variations beyond that's what's formally intended for an organization, but that itself represents a pattern of behavior. One of the clear examples of this we all are familiar with is the secretary receptionist who gains a great deal of power out of all proportion to the job description that he or she actually fills. And usually that doesn't happen overnight. When we're seeing people, secretaries or executive assistants or something like that, that have that kind of power, it generally develops over time. And we'll see why that can happen. But once obtained, it's really durable. Now, as we begin our examination of key concepts, let's start by looking at power. Really one of the more important ones, because if you remember, we've talked about organizations as a social arena where power is intendedly distributed unevenly across participants or across members. So it would seem to reason that power is a fairly important variable with regard to organizations. Now, in the literature on organization, centralization is the concept that you see very, very frequently used as the kind of summary concept about power that speaks to the extent to which power is concentrated in a system. Now, the opposite of centralization is decentralization. So decentralization is the extent to which power is distributed across members of an organization as opposed to concentrated. Distributed as opposed to concentrated. Now, we've talked about some of these things before. We're going to talk about them now in our most focused way. But I want you to think of power as a social psychological variable. It's a social psychological phenomenon. And for me, the single most important statement I've ever heard about power is that from Emerson, a sociologist. And it was he who wrote that power resides implicitly in the other's dependence. Now, it's interesting because in our culture, power is one of those things that's semi-taboo to talk about, especially when we're talking about interpersonal relationships. It's not taboo to talk about if we're talking about politics. It's not taboo to talk about if we're talking among friends and we're complaining about somebody's abuse of power, particularly if we've been the one who's been abused. But when you're talking about relationships, particularly when there's any kind of emotional intimacy that's involved, that's when it starts to become somewhat emotionally dangerous, at least or interpersonally dangerous within our culture. Because if you think of any relationship that you have, you can begin to explore its power dimensions. Two people pass on a corner. They know They don't know one another. They have no interaction with one another. Is there any power there in the interaction? Probably not, the way I've described it. Neither sees the other as important. Neither sees the other as in command of any kind of resource which is valued by the other. Right. On the other hand, if you're in a long-going, intimate, emotional relationship, people will have power over one another. And it's the extent to which you depend upon that other person that helps to give them power over you. Of course, even as you're depending upon them, that other may be depending upon you. Let's hope that that's the case in an intimate relationship like that. And so you have power over the other. Do you think that power in a relationship like that is a static phenomenon? Or do you think it's dynamic, changing over time? Dynamic and changing over time, isn't it? Yeah. And the first time the other person gets you really angry, all of a sudden you realize you have a whole lot more power than you thought you did because you don't care as much about that other person for a while, right? Whatever it was that you valued in them beforehand that gave them power over you, right? That's not as important anymore. You've minimized their power over you for a period of time. Right? Maybe it's until you come to your senses, right? Who knows? Now, Benson goes on to argue that the basis of power rests in command over resources. That which is, it's that, if you will, that Emerson is alluding to when he's talking about dependence. Now, the resource doesn't have to be a tangible resource. It doesn't have to be gold. It doesn't have to be ammunition or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be food. It can be your love or your respect or just your attention for another individual who values that. That's a resource. Now, the key to this, which you think of the basis of power as a social psychological thing that actually has a network, if you will, that helps to support it. Because if you, first of all, you have to value the resource the other commands in order for that person to begin to gain power over you. Secondly, that resource that they command, that has to be somewhat scarce, doesn't it? Because if it's readily available, they don't have anything that approaches a monopoly on the marketplace for that particular resource. You can easily access it from somebody else or some other place. And then the key feature here is as well that there's a non-substitutability factor here. That I need the resource that you command. I really can't get it very many other places, and not only can I get it, I can't get anything else that will do the job for me in the way the resource you command has. Okay. Now, if something happens to your network, the ANA network for resource control, all right, so that you no longer gain access to that or control over that, then your power over me, because of my dependence on you for that, is going to be severely diminished. If all of a sudden you gain access to it as well, then the semi-monopoly you've had in the past is diminished by the ability to me to access that same resource through you. And as long as my need for that, my value for that remains constant, right, then I'm still in a relatively powerless position, but I may be able to actually negotiate some kind of alternative because the marketplace for that resource is kind of opening up for me. Oh, and guess what? Maybe I have command of a resource that you value. And so that's when we start to get into a trading relationship, if you will. The power becomes more complex. When we're looking at power in interpersonal relationships, when we're looking at it in terms of group, when we're looking at it in terms of an organization, even nation states or whatever, we're going to see power as a dynamic variable. It can vary in the amount of power available at any given time. It's possible, for example, that the ability of an organization to control the behavior of its members can ebb or flow, grow or diminish, depending upon a variety of events. So the amount of power available to an organization, just as an amount of power available to an individual, can vary. The type or types of power can vary. That's what we're going to get to right down here with this French and Raven conceptualization. The distribution of power very much can vary. Who gains access to the various sources of power. And the basis of power can vary. Again, that's going to be reflected in some of the terminology that we use down here. There are a variety of other dimensions by which power can vary as well. These are just some of the basic ones. Now, French and Raven authored one of the most popular typologies of power that you're going to find in the organizational administrative literature. And they're differentiating power on the basis of type. And you're also going to see, as we go through this, that different kind of resources are valued. And power is going to be expressed in different ways with some pretty important consequences here. This is in no necessary order. And what I'm offering you here is actually a 6-part conceptualization. French and Raven earlier had offered a 5-point conceptualization. I'll tell you what that is in just a second. It really has to do with this. They've split out expert and knowledge power a bit. Let's start with the expert power. What do you think the basis of expert power is? Knowledge. But that's here too, all right? Which is the reason they split it out and the reason originally they didn't have it split out. Yeah, the basis of expert power and the basis of knowledge power is, in both cases, is knowledge. But there's going to be different kinds of knowledge that they're talking about here. When you're thinking of an expert, what are you thinking of? A master of some kind of trade or a master of a discipline or something like that. Yeah, that's exactly right. So what they're referring to here is a person who has particular expertise, who has mastery over the knowledge of a particular field, a particular discipline. It might be a particular technology. Now, if we go back here to Emerson and Benson, particularly when we're talking about valued resources here, wouldn't we also be able to make the claim that the power of expertise, or the expert power, that which is commanded has to be of value to others within that particular context? Okay? Yeah. So if we're talking about an organization, for example, where somebody has expert power, then we're also talking about somebody who has expertise within an area that's relevant to certain constituencies, coalitions of individuals within that organization. Now, quite probably, that expertise is somehow related to the mandate, mission, or goals of the formal organization. But you know something? It might also be command over a knowledge base that's important to members who want to gain control of the organization. So it might be a much more selfish, if you will, kind of set or arena of knowledge that helps somebody gain that kind of power through that kind of expertise. So the basis of the expertise needs to be valued, but it doesn't have to be related to the organizational goals. Generally will be, doesn't have to be. Now let's just distinguish between knowledge power here. Remember the example of the secretary or receptionist, administrative assistant who gains power over time? We might think of that as knowledge power or informational power in this case. It's not mastery over a particular corpus of knowledge, a discipline, a technology, but it's knowledge of process, it's knowledge of history, it's knowledge of people, it's knowledge of organizational and interorganizational politics, it's knowledge of events. And that knowledge can be very, very important to certain decision makers throughout the organizational hierarchy. We're going to see later on that one of the bases for the power of lower participants in organizations, people that officially should be closer to the bottom of an organization in terms of its power array, is their irreplaceability. And you see, it may be easy to replace a secretary, an administrative assistant, a receptionist, but to replace that person with the same knowledge of history and of events and persons and shortcuts, etc., why, that's virtually impossible to do. So that gives that individual a considerable amount of power as well. Now, personal power is somewhat akin to Weber's notion of charisma. Remember, we had talked earlier about Weber arguing that charisma was one of those things that converted raw power into legitimate power. In the face of a charismatic individual, we suspend our critical judgment. We're more willing to follow. But what we can see here from French and Raven is that one's personal attributes, whether those are physical or whether those are behavioral or whatever, can be valued in and of their own right and can be the basis of power. Positional power refers to the power that is vested in an organizational status, an organizational position, an organizational title, and then made available to somebody who occupies that particular position. Somebody gets busted, somebody gets demoted, they lose the positional power they once had. Now, they may still have considerable amount of expert power, knowledge power, and for all we know, a lot of personal power. So it's not that they're stripped of their power, they're not stripped of their influence, but what they may have been stripped of, and will be by definition here, is the positional power, and if they remain within the organization in a different position, then it's the power of the new position that complements whatever other sources or types of power that have continued with them. Now, if somebody is busted, somebody's demoted or something like that, it might affect perceptions of their expertise. It might affect perceptions of the personal qualities that they have. They may no longer be seen, perhaps, as quite as valuable to have as a friend or as an accomplice or whatever. And so such a drastic kind of administrative action like that or personnel action could also influence some of these other types and sources of power. Just like a promotion. Somebody gets promoted, their positional power is probably increased and changed. Qualitative and quantitative changes to the positional power they had. But what does it mean in terms of the perception of the individual as an expert within their role? See, that may increase as well. The value of association with that individual may increase. So their personal attributes may also be seen in a different light. Reward power, just what it sounds like. It's the ability to reward either symbolically or materially individuals. Hey, if you go out and get me a Coke, I'll give you $100. Okay. Who's ready to go? Yeah. Yeah. See, that's why you got so much power 5 minutes ago. Willingness to jump on that kind of thing. All right. Punishment power is the ability to administer sanctions to individuals. It's punishment. Again, symbolic, could be material, could be corporal, physical. Do you think that those different kinds of power are experienced by subordinates in the same way? In other words, yeah, do you feel toward somebody who's in a higher up position, say in an organization from you, the same way, regardless of whether or not that person is an expert, regardless of whether that person is a kind and charismatic individual, regardless of whether that person is punitive in his or her interaction with you, or very supportive? you feel differently with regard to the behavior of the individual, don't you? As a function of the way that power plays out. Okay, so let's stop for a second here, and let's begin to consider the sources or types of power that are available to an individual. Right. Yeah, quick little exercise. Right. Take out a piece of paper, or you're not going to turn these things in. This is just for an exercise here. Start listing, if you would, your sources or bases of power, your types of power that you have in your life right now. What was that?
She stripped us of our power with the quizzes.
The power of the quiz. What are some of the types and bases of power that you exercise in your own life? If you have relationships, I'll bet you exercise some power in relationships. If you're a parent, bet you exercise some power in your role as parent. If you have teenagers, I'll bet you wish you had more power in your relationships as a parent. If your teenage kid is 15, you wish that there weren't a death penalty. Then think about important groups in your life. Right? Think about important groups in your life. And it can be a friendship group, might be a study group, might be a group at your work or placement. Think of the power of the group. Not of the individual, not of you in the group, but the power of the group. What are some of the sources of a group's power that you have experience with? Mallory, feel comfortable sharing some of your individual?
I'm married. And I don't know how you want me to.
Well, first of all, don't say anything that's going to be embarrassing. I mean, this is not a disclosure group or a therapy group or whatever. So in your relationship, let's say with your husband.
I take care of all of our finances.
Okay, all right. And what kind of, if we were to go back to that array of bases or types of power, how would you categorize that?
I guess, I don't really want to call it that, but I guess expert.
I would think so too, yeah. Particular expertise, yeah. Particularly if you've taken over from somebody who can't even, let's say, balance a checkbook and all of a sudden you're doing this kind of stuff? Yeah, okay. All right. What's another basis of power in your relationship? Not just with your husband, but in your life as you experience it?
The ability, I don't know if you, at my internship,
Go ahead.
referring a client for a prescriber or not.
So the ability, maybe in the client's eyes, to reward or not with a referral, perhaps, could be also the knowledge power you have in terms of what agencies exist. That might even, again, that blends toward the expertise. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Cecily, how about you? Anything in terms of the individual that you care to share?
Thinking like the last one that she just said, I was thinking about with my clients, like reward.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't think about that. And then knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Who over here? JJ?
I guess the knowledge thing, with running a home and stuff, but if I don't cook, they starve, probably. So I'm the expert when it comes to preparing meals, shopping,
Okay.
making sure everybody gets fed.
Okay. I would hope that each of you would feel that you have some power in terms of the attention and affection that you have to share with people in your life. That's an important source of power. But what you've mentioned, all of what you mentioned, yeah, bases of power for individuals. How about the basis or types of power that a group might have? What are some ideas that you've come up with that? Family. Okay, what's the power of a family? What are some of a source or type of power that a family has?
Resources.
The command over resources. Command over resources that are important to people. Another?
Support.
What do you mean by support?
You get support from a family.
So that has value there. Anybody think of the expertise that a group might bring to an organization? Or the ability to get something done for a community through a group? You know?
I was thinking about groups that come in and do evaluations, accreditation.
What's their power? Yeah, it's a variety of those ones that we listed, wasn't it? Yeah. They come with some level of expertise, but if we're the ones who are being accredited, we likely see it as the power to reward or punish that they're bringing with them. Sure. Right. How about a department or a particular section of an organization? Do you think that all departments in an organization have the same level of power? Not a bit, right? Not a bit. You can tell the people working in human service organizations right away. No. Okay. What might be the basis of power of an organization and of a department of an organization? And what might account for it being more or less than some other department, some other division?
Corporate office.
I think expertise.
Expertise is one. Okay, so based on the nature, the type, the amount?
I guess like position. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
They vary on the technical skills that they bring.
They vary in technical skills, and some of those technical skills may not be as valued as much, or there might not be as much of a command over those technical skills in one department as opposed to another. When we're talking about technical skills, we'll talk about this just in passing later on, but the relationship of the technical skills over the mastery of core technologies becomes very, very important. Right? So if we have two technologies that are equally important to an organization, and one department really, really has command over that technology, and another department over here has limited command over that technology, the two technologies equally important to the organization, we would expect more power to be commanded by this particular department over here. Sure. How about the organization as a whole? Do organizations vary in the amount of power they get to play with, they get to express?
CPS, they have a lot of power.
Who it is?
CPS has a lot of power.
With regard to?
Maybe removing children or...
That's right. Women and children, family life, etc. Right. They don't have much power with regard to the economy. So the power of an organization is going to be limited to some extent by the sectors within which it has some kind of legal standing or market standing. Sure.
If you look at the rating that we did too, if you look at the moral power that an organization has as a whole,
Yes.
it's phenomenal when you look at that in that context.
Do you think some organizations have more moral authority than others?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that human service organizations will typically have more moral authority than a conventional business establishment? Yeah, generally will. They might not have as much economic power. They may not have other expressions of power available to them. But the moral authority, is important there. And even within the moral authority notion, Roland Warren, a sociologist of power, sociologist of organization, of community, talks about what he calls community decision organizations, CDOs, community decision organizations. And by definitions, these are the organizations within a city, within a town or a community that are regarded as the leader, the organizational leaders, the organizational spokespersons for certain human service sectors within the community. So typically you might find, for example, the County Board of Education as the CDO, the Community Decision Organization, for all things having to do with education of youngsters. You might find a County Health Department as the CDO for all things having to do with general public health. Now, it might not be a county health department. For example, in a town like Johnson City, where we've got a very, very strong medical school here, it could well be the ETSU Medical School, or it might be one of the major hospitals here that really is regarded as the community decision organization for things having to do with public health in the community. So they vary. Police department, very commonly regarded as the CDO for public safety within a community. So the moral authority of the community decision organization would typically be higher or lower than other human service organizations within its respective arena. Would the moral authority of the CDO, the community decision organization, typically be higher or lower than other organizations within that same sector, human service sector? Higher, that's right, that's right. And one of the things that Warren's work points to was the level of cooperation that CDOs are able to generate within their sectors, limiting conflict between various subordinate organizations within the same human service sector.
Dr. Smith,
Yeah.
the CDOs, is that a formal organization that carry that title, or is that just something, a moniker that comes to them because everybody knows they're the leader in that?
It's the latter. It's the latter. They are formal organizations, yes, but they're not necessarily designated through vote or through a gubernatorial selection or whatever to be the CDO. They evolve to that pinnacle of power within their respective human service sector over time. And so their basis of those kind of things would likely be the amount of resources that they command, their track record and effectiveness, the expertise they have, and all those other kind of bases of power that we've alluded
But you
to.
wouldn't see a plaque outside their building saying, we are the CDO in this community.
No, you typically wouldn't, although sometimes you might. Again, you might be, well, if you see like County Health Department, for example, they're making it clear that they're there to serve and to help develop and design the programs and policies and plans to serve the community or the whole county. But whether or not they're the CDO is an entirely different story. So yeah, there'll likely be a sign there, but it won't be a sign that says we're the CDO. Interesting thing about that research, by the way, and it's a bit dated, but I have no reason to believe that it isn't current. Came out of research that was published in 1974. And Warren and his colleagues were looking at the Model Cities program. And the Model Cities program was actually a program that came out of the Johnson administration. And it was an effort of the federal government to seed certain American cities all across the nation, very, very many different kinds of cities and towns, with money, and to build up the economic and social infrastructure of those towns. And what the researchers found is that regardless of location, regardless of town, those cities tended to operate with the same kind of frameworks, the same kind of decision-making structures in terms of how to spend the money. And what it amounted to was that the people who were the spokespersons of the CDOs became the major players in the planning for the distribution of these monies. So in fact, the research wasn't even designed to identify these community decision organizations. The researchers were largely ignorant that American cities had this kind of organization for human services. It emerged out of the research when they came back and began to do a preliminary examination of the data. And then they went back out with a much more focused effort to examine the power and the role of organizations within the community.
What was the research called?
I'm trying to remember the name of the of the work now, and I can't write offhand, but the author was Roland Warren. And if you cross-index that with community decision organizations, or just see me when I've got some time to go back into my notes, I'll probably be able to find it for you. You're welcome. Now, there's a fellow by the name of David Mechanic who was aware of the phenomenon of the very, very powerful secretary. And so I began to ask the question, well, how is it that people who are in the lower levels of intended power distribution can begin to exercise such inordinate influence within an organization? And what he came up with was a list of a variety of ways where lower participants can gain power far beyond anything the organization intended. So we're beginning to appreciate informal structure. Let's start looking at people who have power far above what one would expect them to have for their position within the organization, for their title. Many times it's for the academic training that they have, or whatever. And here we come right to one of the first ones, the expertise that one has as one jobs, especially if they are irreplaceable. And by the way, someone with a great deal more insight than I once commented that if you're irreplaceable, they may not be able to fire you, but you can't get promoted either. All right? So be careful when you try to settle yourself in and prove yourself to be irreplaceable. The effort and interest that people express on the job can be valued and can be the source of power for those individuals as well. That's easy enough to understand, isn't it? If you're a supervisor and one of the people that you're working, that's working with you or for you, you're supervising, is really devoted to that, it's very, very visible, they put a lot of energy into that kind of thing, you're likely to favor them in a variety of ways. That's human nature. Personal attractiveness. Right? You're not going to find that on a job description for the most part. You will on some. Right? But it's a basis of power. And different strokes for different folks comes to mind. The physical location and position within an organization may be a factor in who has power and who doesn't. You might be doing the same job as a coworker, but the coworker is stationed in a satellite. Isn't visible, isn't there. And so the boss, if choosing to make one of the two of you happy, for example, more likely perhaps to choose you, as opposed to a coworker who's largely invisible to that individual. Okay. Rules can be the basis of power of lower participants. Many times because rules cannot fully account for all of the contingencies required for organizational effectiveness. My father used to work on the railroad. And one of the things that the railroad used to do, well, railroads were unionized. But every time the union would strike, management would ask Congress to invoke the Taft-Hartley amendment, which has to do with constraint of trade, I believe. And so Congress would step in and order the railroaders back to work. So the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen was largely bereft of the kind of power that unions typically have in an American unionized environment. So you know what the next step was? Rigid adherence to rules. Okay, we'll go back to work, but we'll make sure we will operate the trains exactly as the rules prescribe. Which means that once we get this train hooked up and we need a signature, we'll walk over, we'll patiently wait for somebody to come out and give us a signature, where we will then patiently walk back and give a copy to somebody who will then eventually give the order for the train to go ahead and leave the station. And now we're 6 hours behind. Why? Because we didn't take any shortcuts. We just adhered to the rules as were written, and things will grind to a halt. So when I earlier mentioned that if you try to eliminate the informal organization, chances are, you're just going to be, it's going to be a frustrating experience, and anything that had led to reasonable levels of organizational achievement were probably going to be lost. Well, this is one of the reasons and one of the ways that happens. informal organization develops in part to meet people's needs, but in part it also arises to actually help the organization achieve tasks, goals. Coalitions. When you think about unionization and collective bargaining, isn't that largely a process whereby lower participants agree to cooperate together to pool their loyalty, their energies, etc., and to create, in a case of a union and collective bargaining, a very formal entity, but even informal entities, informal coalitions can begin to gather power through organization, through collective action. These are some of the ways that lower participants can gain power. Now, the other side of the power supervisor-supervisee relationship is something that Donald Warren addressed. Now, this is Donald Warren as opposed to Roland Warren, whom I mentioned a little bit before. And Donald Warren, in talking about compliance, differentiates between behavioral compliance and attitudinal compliance. And basically the distinction is this. With behavioral compliance, the individual's behavior conforms to expectations or directions, but there's no incorporation of any kind of normative structure. The person doesn't change the way he or she thinks or feels. What he or she does is change the way one acts only. Attitudinal compliance, however, involves a change, an incorporation of some kind of normative value, some kind of belief, some kind of preference. And the behavior that follows, generally consistent with that new belief or value. So the behavior may well be, and most probably is, in the direction of that which was instructed. Right? It may be even more so. Why might it even be more so? Why might the behavior be even more than what was directed if we're talking about attitudinal compliance?
They'll care about it.
Because they care about it. Because they care about it now. That's exactly right. So of the two, which would you regard as the more fundamental, the more powerful, the more significant kind of compliance? Attitudinal compliance or behavioral compliance? Attitudinal compliance, that's exactly right. But guess what? When we look at the kinds of power, this time simply using French and Raven's 5-part typology, where knowledge is subsumed in expert, right? We see that different kinds of power elicit different kinds of compliance. The R here is the simple Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. So research, for example, showed that in relation to the expression of power, that coercive power, right, tended to be positively related, R equals 0.661, with behavioral compliance. And it wasn't statistically significant in terms of its relationship to attitudinal compliance. Parents, do you remember how frustrating it is when you might be able to generate behavioral compliance, but the kid still is not going to buy into your values, your thinking, etc.? Yeah, sure. All right. Oh, by the way, so you treat them instead. Look, it's still behavioral compliance over here. It's what's significant is it's much less, right? It's the unfortunate reality that this research would suggest is that you're actually able to derive more behavioral compliance through punishing somebody than through awarding them. I suspect that's accurate, to be real frank about it. But the important thing here is punishing, rewarding, you have some level of control over shaping behavior, but the behavior that you're shaping is simply behavior, not attitudes, not values. On the other hand, statistically significant relationships between attitudinal compliance with referent power. Now, referent power is the power of personality. Referent power is akin to charisma. Notice some level of, and a fairly significant one, relating to legitimate power and attitudinal compliance. Legitimate power is the power of position. The boss in a logically, rationally constituted organization, for example. And expert power has some statistically significant relationship to attitudinal conformity. So again, we go back to this notion that the kind of power, the basis of power, the expression of power can have important and differential impact upon the level of compliance and the type of compliance. Now, if I were to ask you to be back here in 10 minutes, right, would you comply with that? And if you did, will that be attitudinal compliance or behavioral compliance? Behavioral. It's just behavioral. I'll be satisfied with that. I'll see you in 10 minutes.